There is a place in the world where the land breathes slowly, where hills roll into other hills and ancient paths wind between them like threads of something very old and very patient. That place is Anatolia, the wide heartland of what we now call Turkey, a land of dry summer grasses and cool stone valleys, of rivers that move without hurrying, of skies that hold their color long after the sun has passed below the horizon. It is a land that has known many peoples, many languages, many dynasties that rose and fell like the slow tide of seasons. And it is here, in the late years of the 13th century, that something began, not with a great noise, not with fire or fury, but quietly, the way most enduring things begin, like the first pale light before dawn, almost imperceptible, spreading so gradually that no one notices until the world is already changed. The story of the Ottoman Empire begins with a man named Osman. He was a tribal leader, a chieftain of a small group of Turkic people who had settled in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, in a region called Bithynia, near the gentle slopes of the mountains that look westward toward distant waters. His people were not numerous. His territory was not vast. By the standards of the great powers of his time, the Mongol Ilkhanate to the east, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire to the west, the various other Turkish principalities scattered across Anatolia like stones across a dry riverbed, Osman's domain was modest, quiet, easy to overlook. And yet something about his leadership, something about the land he occupied and the moment he occupied it, allowed his small principality to grow. Slowly, steadily, like a root finding its way through soil. We do not know a great deal about Osman the man. History has left us only fragments, soft impressions, the kind of partial knowledge that feels like a half-remembered dream. We know that he was born sometime around 1258, which was itself a year of great upheaval in the wider world, the year the Mongols sacked Baghdad and brought the Abbasid Caliphate to its end. But none of that distant catastrophe touched Osman directly. His world was smaller, closer, more immediate. It was the world of grazing lands and frontier skirmishes, of relationships with neighboring lords, of slow negotiations and quiet alliances. He was, in the manner of many great founders, a man suited to his particular moment and place, patient, persistent, willing to move gradually rather than boldly. The principality that Osman led was known as a beylik, one of many such small Turkish principalities that had emerged as the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the great Turkish power that had previously dominated Anatolia, weakened and fractured under Mongol pressure. These beyliks were like the pieces of a puzzle that had fallen apart, each piece settling into its own corner, each governed by its own lord, its own customs, its own ambitions. Osman's beylik occupied a particularly advantageous position, though perhaps advantage is too forceful a word. Let us say instead that his land lay in a fortunate direction. It sat on the frontier between what remained of the Byzantine world and the expanding Turkish presence in Anatolia. This frontier was a soft and permeable thing. People crossed it in both directions. Trade moved along it. Cultures blended at its edges. And for a leader willing to be patient, willing to absorb and include rather than simply conquer and exclude, this frontier was a place of gradual, quiet possibility. The Byzantine Empire in this period was itself something diminished, something tired. It had once been the great Eastern continuation of Rome, a civilization of golden mosaics and learned philosophers and fleets that commanded the seas. But that was long ago now. By the time of Osman's life, the Byzantine Empire had contracted, had lost great territories, had endured civil wars and economic decline, and the slow erosion of its own vitality. Constantinople, its capital, still stood magnificent and ancient behind its famous walls. But the countryside, the villages and small towns of the Byzantine hinterland in Anatolia, were less secure, less defended, more open to the gradual encroachments of neighboring powers. And it was into this hinterland that Osman and his followers moved, not as a flood but as a slow tide, pressing gently against what was already yielding. It is worth pausing here to think about what life was like in these frontier lands, in these quiet spaces between empires. Picture a small settlement in the hills of northwestern Anatolia in the early 14th century. Stone houses, low and warm in the summer heat, the smell of wood smoke in the cooler mornings, flocks of sheep moving across the open hillsides with the unhurried patience of animals that have nowhere particular to be. The people of these villages were a mixture Greek-speaking Christians who had been there for many generations, Turkish-speaking Muslims who had come more recently, and the various gradations between them, the people of mixed heritage and fluid identity that frontier zones always produce. They lived in proximity. They traded at the same markets. Their children sometimes played together in the dusty spaces between houses. The great questions of empire and religion that occupied scholars and sultans were, to these villagers, distant and abstract things like clouds on a far horizon. Osman was adept at moving through this mixed world. He formed alliances with local Greek Christian lords as well as with Turkish tribal leaders. He married into prominent families. He attracted followers through a reputation for fairness and steady leadership rather than through fear or force alone. His domain absorbed people of various backgrounds, and this absorption would become one of the defining characteristics of the state he founded. An openness to incorporating others, a pragmatic flexibility about identity and belonging that would serve the empire well for many generations to come. It was not a rigid thing that Osman was building. It was something more like a loose weaving, a gathering of threads from different sources, patient and gradual in its construction. The year 1299 is traditionally given as the founding date of the Ottoman state, though like so many such dates in early history, it is more a convenient marker than a precise moment of transformation. There was no single day on which Osman declared an empire, no formal ceremony of founding, no dramatic proclamation sent to the far corners of the world. What there was, instead, was a gradual accumulation of territory, of followers, of local authority, until it became clear that something new and lasting had come into being. The name Ottoman, by which the empire and its people would be known to the world, is simply the westernized version of Osman's own name, a reminder that what grew into a civilization of 3 continents was, at its root, the extended projection of one patient man's small principality in the western Anatolian hills. In 1301, Osman's forces achieved what might be called their first significant military success, at a place called Baphius, near the ancient city of Nicomedia. A Byzantine force sent to check the expansion of Osman's principality was turned back, and the encounter, modest though it was by the standards of later Ottoman warfare, sent a quiet signal across the frontier world. Osman's Beylik was not simply surviving, it was growing. And those who lived in the borderlands began to take notice, began to adjust their own calculations accordingly. Some fled westward, seeking the security of Byzantine towns and cities. Others, more practically minded, made their peace with the new order taking shape around them, finding that life under Osman's governance was not so different from what they had known before: the same hills, the same seasons, the same slow rhythms of agricultural and pastoral life, only with different lords collecting different taxes in a different language. Osman died sometime around 1323 or 1324, an old man by the standards of his time, having spent his life in the patient work of building something durable. He left to his son, Orhan, a principality larger and more stable than the one he had inherited, a community with its own customs and institutions beginning to take shape, a reputation that drew ambitious men from across Anatolia to offer their services. It was Orhan who would begin the next phase of what his father had started, pushing the boundaries of the principality further westward, into more deeply Byzantine territory, capturing towns of increasing importance and establishing the administrative structures that would, over time, become the framework of an empire. The capture of Bursa in 1326 was one of those quiet turning points that only become visible in retrospect. Bursa was not a frontier village. It was a real city, a substantial Byzantine urban center sitting in the foothills below a great mountain, its streets lined with caravanserais and markets, its churches ancient and cool inside their thick stone walls. When Orhan took Bursa and made it his capital, something shifted. The Ottoman Principality was no longer simply a frontier beylik, a tribal territory of grazing lands and scattered settlements. It now had a proper city at its center, a place of commerce and administration, a place where the institutions of governance could take more permanent form. Bursa became the first Ottoman capital, the place where the slow work of building a state began in earnest. Orhan would go on to capture Nicaea in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337, pushing the Byzantines further back, absorbing more of the northwestern Anatolian landscape into his expanding domain. These were not swift campaigns. They unfolded over years, with the patient persistence that characterized the early Ottoman approach to expansion. Sieges could last many months, sometimes longer. Negotiations might stretch across seasons. The Ottoman advance was not a rush, but a gradual, almost inevitable seeming pressure, like the slow spreading of water finding its level across a flat surface. It was also under Orhan that the first recognizably Ottoman institutions began to take shape. The Janissaries, the elite military corps that would become so central to Ottoman power in later centuries, had their origins in this period, a standing force of trained soldiers loyal directly to the Sultan, something different from the tribal levies and feudal obligations that had characterized earlier modes of military organization. The process by which these soldiers were recruited, young boys taken from Christian families in the conquered territories, raised as Muslims, trained from childhood in warfare and loyalty to the Ottoman household, was called devshirme, and it was a system at once strange and pragmatic, creating a class of soldiers and administrators who had no tribal loyalties, no family networks to distract their devotion, belonging wholly to the Sultan and to the state he embodied. This system would not be fully developed until later reigns, but its foundations were laid in these quiet early decades, in the unhurried work of institution building that Orhan carried forward from his father's time. Orhan also made a significant, if quiet, move that would have long consequences. He established a relationship with the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, who was at the time embroiled in a civil war over control of Constantinople and badly needed military allies. Orhan married one of Cantacuzene's daughters, a woman named Theodora, cementing the alliance through family. This was not an unusual arrangement in the frontier world. It was the ordinary diplomacy of neighboring powers seeking mutual advantage, but it had an extraordinary side effect. In 1352, Cantacuzinos asked for Orhan's military assistance and received it, and in the process, Ottoman soldiers crossed the narrow body of water that separates Asia from Europe, the Dardanelles, that quiet channel of blue water that has always seemed so small on a map and so consequential in history, and set foot on the European continent for the first time. They were there as allies, as temporary military assistants. But the crossing happened. And once it happened, the direction of things had quietly changed. By 1354, the Ottomans had established a permanent foothold in Europe. They took the town of Gallipoli, situated at the tip of the European side of the Dardanelles, and held it despite protests from both the Byzantines and other powers. From Gallipoli, the European landscape opened before them like a slow, unhurried panorama. The rolling hills of Thrace, the ancient roads that led northward and westward, the scattered towns and villages of a Balkan world already weakened by plague, by political fragmentation, by the long accumulated fatigue of too many conflicts. The Ottoman presence in Europe had begun, and it would not end for many centuries. Orhan died in 1362, having presided over a transformation so gradual that it might almost have seemed natural, as if the Ottoman state had not been built but had simply grown, like a tree from a seed, following the slow logic of its own nature. He left to his son Murad a domain that now spanned 2 continents, a state with functioning institutions, and a capital that hummed with commerce and administration, an army that was becoming something organized and effective and distinct from anything that had come before in this part of the world. Murad I, who ruled from 1362 until his death in 1389, continued the patient expansion that had characterized his predecessors. He moved the Ottoman capital from Bursa to Edirne, the ancient city of Adrianople in Thrace, making the European dimension of the empire not a peripheral concern, but a central one. From Edirne, Murad looked westward into the Balkans, and what he saw there was a landscape of opportunity, not the opportunity of easy conquest, but the opportunity of steady, gradual absorption. The Balkan states of this period, the Serbian kingdom, the Bulgarian tsardom, the various principalities and lordships of the region, were powerful in their own rights but divided among themselves, unable to mount a unified resistance to the slow Ottoman pressure. One by one, some by force, some by negotiation, some by becoming vassal states that maintained their own rulers and customs while acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty, the Balkan territories began to enter the Ottoman orbit. It is worth lingering on this word, suzerainty, because it captures something important about how the early Ottoman state expanded and sustained itself. The Ottomans did not, in general, insist on uniform cultural or religious transformation in the territories they absorbed. Christian lords could remain Christian lords and continue to govern their people, provided they paid tribute and provided military service to the Sultan when required. This was a pragmatic arrangement. It reduced the costs of administration. It limited resistance. It allowed the Ottoman state to expand faster than it could have if every conquered territory required complete reorganization from the ground up. And it created, in those borderlands and absorbed principalities, a kind of layered world where Ottoman authority sat at the top of existing structures rather than replacing them entirely. This is not to paint the early Ottoman expansion as a gentle or entirely peaceful process. There were battles, there were sieges, there were people displaced from their homes, fields burned in the logic of war, families separated, lives disrupted by the slow march of change. The suffering that accompanies any political transformation was present here too, even if we hold it gently, without dramatizing it. But compared to many other historical empires that expanded primarily through overwhelming force and radical reorganization, the early Ottoman approach had a particular quality of absorption and accommodation that made it, in many cases, more durable than alternatives might have been. Murad's reign ended at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, one of those moments that history remembers with a particular weight. A coalition of Balkan forces, Serbian, Bosnian, Hungarian, and others, came together in an attempt to check Ottoman expansion, and the two armies met on the field of the Blackbirds in what is now Kosovo. The battle was fierce and costly on both sides, and in the aftermath of what was ultimately an Ottoman victory, Murad himself was killed, perhaps by a wounded Serbian nobleman who reached him in the confusion of the battlefield's end. It was a quiet death, in its way, not on the field of open combat, but in the still, terrible moment after the fighting had stopped. His son Bayezid I took the Sultanate and continued the expansion with perhaps rather more speed than his predecessors had typically favored. Bayezid earned the nickname Yildirim, meaning thunderbolt, for the swiftness of his military movements. He pressed further into the Balkans, tightened the noose around Constantinople, which still stood, still Byzantine, an ancient city behind its ancient walls, watching the empire that surrounded it with the patient anxiety of the beleaguered, and extended Ottoman authority eastward into Anatolia as well, absorbing the other Turkish beyliks that had long existed alongside his family's domain. But Bayezid's speed carried its own dangers. In the east, a new power had risen, Timur, known in some traditions as Tamerlane, a Mongol Turkic conqueror of staggering military capability who had swept across Persia and Central Asia, and was now turning his attention westward. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Timur and Bayezid met on a dry Anatolian plain in midsummer heat, and the Ottoman forces were overwhelmed. Bayezid was captured, the only Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner in battle, and he died in captivity the following year. The Ottoman state, which had seemed so firmly established, so confidently growing, was plunged into a period of internal conflict as Bayezid's sons fought among themselves for the sultanate. This period, which historians call the Ottoman interregnum, lasted from 1402 to 1413, and it was a time of genuine uncertainty, a pause in the steady expansion that had characterized the dynasty's first century. But the state survived. The institutions that had been built, the trained military forces, the administrative structures, the religious and legal frameworks, proved resilient enough to endure even the absence of clear central authority. And when maimed, I emerged as Sultan in 1413, having gradually overcome his brothers in the slow competition of those 11 uncertain years. He found that the Ottoman state was wounded but not broken. The roots had held. Maimed, I spent his reign in the careful work of restoration, rebuilding what the Civil War had damaged, re-establishing authority over territories that had drifted during the years of uncertainty, restoring the relationships with vassal states and neighboring powers that kept the empire's edges quiet and manageable. It was not glamorous work. It was the work of administration and diplomacy, of steady attention to the thousand details that keep a complex political organism functioning. But it was necessary, and maimed I did it with the patient competence of a ruler who understood that stability was more valuable than glory. His son Murad II continued this work of consolidation and careful expansion through his long reign from 1421 to 1451. Murad was a thoughtful ruler, not without military capability. He faced several significant challenges, including a long siege of Constantinople that he ultimately abandoned, and various conflicts in the Balkans, but inclining, when possible, toward diplomacy and patience rather than speed and force. He navigated the complex politics of the Balkan world with considerable skill, maintaining Ottoman authority while managing the always shifting web of alliances and rivalries among the Christian powers of the region. Murad II also patronized culture and learning in ways that would become more characteristic still of his successors. The Ottoman court under his reign began to take on the qualities of a true imperial center, a place where poets and scholars were welcomed, where architecture was commissioned and music cultivated, where the physical grandeur of the Sultanate was expressed in buildings of genuine beauty. Edirne, the European capital, grew more elaborate under his patronage. The mosques and markets and caravanserais that he commissioned gave the city a quality of settled, confident civilization, the air of a state that expected to endure. And so, by the time Murad II's son Mehmed II came to the throne in 1451, what had been Osman's small frontier principality in the Anatolian hills had become something unmistakably different. A state of significant territory, sophisticated institutions, a clear sense of its own identity and trajectory, a ruling dynasty that had now extended itself across 5 generations with a consistency of purpose that was itself a kind of achievement. The world of the late 15th century was a different world from that of Osman's day, and the state that bore his name had grown and changed with it, absorbing the centuries as it had absorbed territories and peoples. Gradually, patiently, with the quiet persistence of something that intends to last. In those hills of northwestern Anatolia where it had all begun, the old frontier world was long gone. The settlements that had once sat uncertainly between Byzantine and Turkish influence were now simply Ottoman, their old ambiguities resolved by the slow passage of time and the gradual settling of authority. The sheep still moved across the hillsides in the morning light, unhurried and indifferent to the history that had unfolded around them. The rivers still ran toward the sea. The sun still rose each day above the pale eastern hills and set each evening beyond the distant waters to the west. The land was, as it had always been, patient and enduring, holding its stories quietly within its soil, keeping the deep memory of all that had passed across it with the still, untroubled silence of ancient things. There is a particular quality to the light in the early morning over the Bosphorus, that narrow winding channel of dark water that separates Europe from Asia, that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and beyond to the wider Mediterranean world. In the hours before full dawn, the water holds a deep, still color, somewhere between gray and blue, and the hills on either shore are soft silhouettes, dark against a sky that is only beginning to consider the possibility of light. It is a quiet scene, a scene that has repeated itself every morning for thousands of years, unchanged in its essential character by all the human drama that has unfolded along its shores. And it was along these shores, in the spring of 1453, that the young Sultan Mehmed II brought his army to rest and wait, looking across the water at the ancient walls of Constantinople, the city that had stood for more than 1,000 years as the capital of the Byzantine world, and contemplating, with the unhurried patience of a man who had been thinking about this moment for most of his life, what came next. Maimed II was 21 years old in 1453, which seems young, and in many ways he was young, intense, restless, intellectually curious in ways that sometimes surprised those around him, a reader of histories and a student of languages who could speak several with varying degrees of fluency. But he had been preparing for this particular undertaking since before he formally took the throne. Constantinople had been a kind of fixed point in Ottoman strategic thinking for decades. It sat in the middle of the empire's geography like a stone in a river, dividing the European and Asian portions of Ottoman territory, held by a Byzantine emperor whose authority was now largely symbolic, but whose city remained an ancient and potent symbol of the Christian Roman world. Every Ottoman sultan since Bayezid I had looked at Constantinople and understood that taking it would be both a practical necessity and something larger, a statement about the Ottoman state's place in the world, its claim to a kind of imperial legitimacy that went beyond mere territorial control. The city's walls were the central problem, and they had been the central problem for every force that had ever attempted to take Constantinople by siege. They were not simply walls. They were a system, a triple line of fortifications along the landward side, a great sea wall along the Golden Horn and the Marmara shore, the whole thing built and rebuilt and reinforced over more than 1,000 years of Byzantine engineering and Byzantine anxiety about the world beyond. They had held against Avars and Arabs, against Vikings and Crusaders, against earlier Ottoman siege attempts. They were the physical expression of Byzantine endurance, and they were formidable in ways that went beyond mere stone and mortar. They had a psychological weight, a reputation that was itself a kind of defense. Maimed had thought carefully about how to overcome them. He had commissioned, from a Hungarian engineer named Urban, an enormous cannon, one of the largest pieces of artillery that had yet been built, a device so heavy that it required many oxen to move, and so loud when fired that it could reportedly be heard from a great distance. He had assembled a fleet to blockade the city from the sea. He had gathered an army considerably larger than the Byzantine forces available for defense. And he had thought through, in the patient way that characterized his planning, the specific problems of the specific walls he intended to breach. The siege began in early April of 1453 and lasted for nearly 2 months, a long and grinding process of bombardment and assault and repair and renewed bombardment, the great cannon firing its enormous stone balls at the ancient walls, while the defenders worked through the nights to fill the gaps with rubble and timber, and whatever else came to hand. On the 29th of May, in the early morning hours while it was still dark, the final assault began. The Byzantine defenders, exhausted by weeks of continuous strain, were too few to hold the entire circuit of walls against a coordinated attack at multiple points. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died in the fighting, his identity lost in the confusion of the final hours, so that his body was never certainly identified afterward. And as the morning light came across the Bosphorus, the Ottoman soldiers were inside the city, moving through streets that had known 1,000 years of Byzantine life, past churches and markets and the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which rose above everything with its vast dome catching the early light and holding it, as it had always held it, with a quality of still, interior radiance. Maimed entered the city later that day, riding slowly through streets that were quieter than they might have been, the initial confusion of the conquest already beginning to settle. He went first to Hagia Sophia, that ancient church of the Holy Wisdom, and stood inside it for some time in the great stillness of its interior, beneath the dome that seemed to float above on its ring of windows, the light coming in from all sides in long, dusty shafts. He ordered that it be converted to a mosque, which it duly was, though the conversion was accomplished with a certain care. The Christian mosaics were plastered over rather than destroyed, preserved beneath the plaster in the darkness, waiting for a future age to rediscover them. The city that had been Constantinople became Istanbul, though the old name would persist in various forms for a long time, fading only gradually, the way names do when a place changes its identity but keeps its geography. The taking of Constantinople was an event of considerable significance in the wider world, and news of it traveled slowly outward from the Bosphorus in all directions, by ship to the ports of Italy and the Aegean, by land across the Balkans and into Central Europe, eastward into Persia and beyond. In Europe particularly, it was received with the gravity of an ending, a sense that something very old had finally concluded. The Byzantine Empire, that long twilight of Rome, was gone. What stood in its place was something new, something that would have its own long story to tell. For maimed II, who would be known thereafter as Maimed the Conqueror, the taking of Constantinople was not an ending but a beginning. He made it his capital, the center of an empire that he now understood in grand and deliberate terms. He worked to repopulate the city, which had shrunk considerably from its ancient heights, by encouraging and sometimes compelling people from across his domains to settle there, Greeks and Armenians and Jews and Turks, creating from the first years of Ottoman Constantinople a city of mixed population and overlapping communities, a place where different peoples lived in proximity in their own quarters, governed by their own religious laws in many matters of daily life, while acknowledging the overarching authority of the Ottoman Sultan above them all. This arrangement, which historians call the millet system, was not invented by Maimed. It had precedence in earlier Islamic governance, but it became under the Ottomans a characteristic feature of imperial administration, a way of managing diversity that was pragmatic and, by the standards of its time, relatively accommodating. Maimed spent the rest of his reign, until his death in 1481, in continued expansion and consolidation. He pushed further into the Balkans, absorbing Serbia, Bosnia, and much of the Peloponnese in Greece. He moved against the independent Turkish principalities that still existed in Anatolia, bringing them firmly under Ottoman control and unifying the Anatolian heartland in a way that earlier sultans had not fully achieved. He even launched an expedition to the Italian coast, landing at Otranto in 1480 in what seemed to herald the beginning of an Ottoman push into Western Europe. But Maimed died the following year, and the Otranto expedition was abandoned, becoming one of those fascinating what-ifs of history, a path that was begun and then gently closed. He was also a man of genuine cultural complexity. He patronized Italian Renaissance artists. The Venetian painter Gentile Bellini came to his court and painted his portrait, a remarkable document of cultural exchange across what might seem an unbridgeable divide. He collected manuscripts and accumulated a substantial library. He was interested in geography, in the shape of the world, in the works of ancient Greek philosophers whose texts he had read in translation. He commissioned new buildings for his capital, mosques and markets and hands, and the first version of the great palace complex that would become Topkapi, with an awareness of architecture as a statement of imperial permanence and ambition. The city of Constantinople under Maimed began its long transformation into something recognizably Ottoman, the skyline slowly accumulating the minarets and domes that would come to define it. After Maimed's death, There was a period of relative consolidation under his son Bayezid II, a more cautious and contemplative ruler who preferred diplomacy to warfare, and spent much of his reign managing the complex politics of a state now large enough to have edges in many directions. Bayezid received with quiet courtesy the Jewish refugees expelled from Spain in 1492, one of the larger expulsions in medieval European history, allowing them to settle throughout Ottoman territories where they established communities that would persist for centuries, bringing with them skills in medicine and commerce and scholarship that enriched the cities where they settled. This was characteristic of Bayezid's style of governance: patient, accommodating, alert to opportunity without urgency. But it was under Selim I, who came to power in 1512 after a struggle with his father and his brothers that left him the sole remaining claimant to the Sultanate, that the empire underwent one of its most significant expansions in a very short period. Selim was a man of fierce energy and considerable ruthlessness, quite different in temperament from his father. He looked eastward, where the Safavid dynasty of Persia had established itself under Shah Ismail, a ruler who promoted a form of Shia Islam that Selim viewed as a threat to the Sunni religious order and to Ottoman authority over the Turkish tribal populations of eastern Anatolia, many of whom felt drawn toward the Safavid religious movement. In 1514, at the Battle of Chaldiran, on a high plain in what is now northwestern Iran, Ottoman forces met the Safavid army and achieved a decisive, if costly, victory, checking Safavid expansion and establishing the approximate border between the two empires that would persist, with variations, for a long time. Then Selim turned south. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, which had long been one of the major powers of the Islamic world, was in a period of weakness. It still controlled the ancient and wealthy lands of the Levant and the Nile Valley, the great cities of Cairo and Damascus and Aleppo, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz. In 1516 and 1517, in a campaign of remarkable speed, here Selim showed the swiftness that distinguished him from his more deliberate predecessors. Ottoman forces defeated the Mamluks first at the Battle of Marj Dabak near Aleppo, and then at the Battle of Ridniya near Cairo. The Mamluk Sultanate ceased to exist. Egypt and Syria and the Levant and the Hijaz all passed into Ottoman hands. The incorporation of the Hijaz was particularly significant because it brought under Ottoman control the two holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina, and with them, the custodianship of the pilgrimage routes and the prestige that attached to being the protector of the faith's most sacred places. Selim also acquired from the last Abbasid claimant, then living in Cairo, a shadow figure with no real power but considerable symbolic weight, the title of Caliph, the nominal leader of the Sunni Muslim world. Whether this transfer of the caliphate was a genuine ceremony with lasting religious significance or more of a political arrangement has been debated by scholars across many generations. But the practical effect was to add another layer of religious authority to the Ottoman sultan's already considerable pile of titles and claims. The Ottoman ruler was now not merely a king or an emperor, but the commander of the faithful, the caliph, the servant of the two holy shrines, titles that carried across the entire Sunni Muslim world a resonance that no merely territorial claim could match. Selim died in 1520, having ruled for only 8 years, but having expanded the empire's territory by an amount that would have taken his predecessors several decades to accumulate. He left to his son Suleiman an empire of extraordinary size and wealth, stretching from the Danube to the Sahara, from the Adriatic to the Persian highlands, encompassing some of the most ancient and productive lands on earth. The valleys of the Nile and the Euphrates and the Tigris, the cedar forests of Lebanon, the olive groves of Greece and Anatolia, the great trading cities of the eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It was the largest empire the Islamic world had seen since the early centuries of the Caliphate, and it was still growing. Suleiman I, who would be known to the Ottoman world as Kanuni, the lawgiver, and to the European world as the Magnificent, came to the throne at the age of 26 and would reign for 46 years, until 1566. His reign is often considered the peak of Ottoman power and civilization, a long, golden afternoon of imperial confidence, cultural flowering, and military reach that extended further than it ever had before or would again. It was an era that, looked back upon, has the quality of a long and beautiful day, complete in itself, something to be experienced slowly rather than rushed through. Suleiman moved against the Christian kingdoms of Central Europe with a deliberateness that his predecessors might have recognized. In 1521, he took Belgrade, the great fortress city on the Danube that had long been a central point of Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion. In 1522, he captured Rhodes, the island in the southeastern Aegean that had been held by the Knights of St. John, a military religious order that had used the island as a base for operations against Ottoman shipping. The knights were allowed to leave with their lives and their dignity, sailing westward to eventually settle on Malta, a settlement that Suleiman probably did not regret, the gracious gesture of a ruler confident enough in his power to afford generosity. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs on the Hungarian plain, Ottoman forces met and overwhelmed the army of the Kingdom of Hungary, killing the Hungarian King Louis II in the process. The Battle of Mohacs was one of those encounters that reshapes the political geography of a region for generations. Hungary, ancient and proud, was broken as an independent power, most of its territory absorbed into the Ottoman system, the remainder becoming a contested borderland between the Ottomans and the Habsburg dynasty of Austria. In 1529, Suleiman led his army all the way to Vienna, the Habsburg capital, and besieged it. Though the siege was ultimately unsuccessful, the Ottoman supply lines stretched too long across the autumn landscape, the weather turning against them, the campaign ending in a withdrawal that was orderly but was nonetheless a withdrawal. The world looked at what the Ottomans had done in the first decades of Suleiman's reign and understood that it was looking at one of the great powers of the age. The European states, divided among themselves by the turbulence of the Reformation and the rivalry of the Habsburgs and the French and the English, were in no position to mount a unified response. Some of them, most notably France under the pragmatic Francis I, sought instead to cultivate diplomatic relations with the Ottomans, seeing in the Sultan's power a potential counterbalance to Habsburg dominance. The Franco-Ottoman alliance, formalized in 1536, was a remarkable thing, a Christian kingdom, and a Muslim empire finding common cause against a common rival, to the outrage of those who felt that religious solidarity should override political calculation. But politics has always had its own patient logic, indifferent to the categories that idealists prefer. The Ottoman navy under Suleiman also became a force of considerable significance in the Mediterranean. The great Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, who had established himself as a naval power in the western Mediterranean, and eventually entered Sulayman's service, built the Ottoman fleet into something capable of challenging the combined naval power of Christian Europe. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, the Ottoman fleet under Barbarossa defeated a Holy League fleet assembled by the Habsburgs, the papacy, and Venice, establishing Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean that would persist for several decades. The sea lanes of the Levant and the Aegean became, in effect, Ottoman waters, the commerce that moved across them taxed and regulated by Ottoman authority, the ports along their shores governed by Ottoman administrators. This naval power also meant that the empire's reach extended further still. The Ottomans developed influence along the North African coast, with Algiers and Tunis, and Tripoli becoming nominally or actually part of the Ottoman sphere. They projected power into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, coming into contact and occasionally conflict with the Portuguese, who had established themselves along the sea routes to India and were disrupting the traditional overland and Red Sea trade routes that had for so long enriched Ottoman-controlled territories. These encounters with Portuguese naval power in distant waters were something new, a reminder that the world was larger than it had been, that the old trade networks were being challenged by new routes and new powers operating in ways that the old frameworks of empire had not anticipated. But within the empire itself, in those long middle decades of Sulayman's reign, there was a quality of settled confidence, of achieved stability that had its own beauty. The great cities of the empire, Istanbul above all, but also Cairo and Damascus and Aleppo and Sarajevo and Athens and Edirne and Bursa, were places of considerable vitality and cultural complexity. The markets of Istanbul were full of goods from across the known world, spices from the east, cloth from the west, grain from Egypt, timber from the Black Sea coast, silk and ceramics and glassware, and the 100 other products that a great empire's commerce produced and circulated. The caravanserais along the trade routes, those great stone buildings that provided shelter and security for merchants and their goods, were full of travelers from many places speaking many languages, sleeping on their mats in the cool interior courtyards while the stars moved slowly overhead. The architecture of the Sulaymanic period has a particular quality that still moves those who see it today. The great architect Mimar Sinan, who served as chief imperial architect from the 1530s until his death in 1588 at what must have been a very advanced age, designed hundreds of buildings across the empire, mosques and bridges and aqueducts and hands and palaces, with a genius for proportion and light, and the careful management of interior space that stands comparison with the greatest architectural achievements of any civilization. His masterpiece, the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, built in the 1550s on a hill overlooking the Golden Horn, is a building of extraordinary calm beauty, its great dome rising above 4 elegant minarets, its interior a vast, luminous space where the light comes in from many windows and seems to gather rather than fall, as if the building itself were gently collecting the day's slow passage of illumination. Sinan also built in the 1570s what he himself considered his greatest work, the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, built for Sulayman's son Selim II. The Selimiye's dome is slightly larger in diameter than that of Hagia Sophia, which Sinan had studied carefully over many years, learning from its ancient engineering the secrets that he then applied and surpassed in his own constructions. The interior of the Selimiye is a single, unified space of great luminosity, the dome seeming to float above a ring of windows through which the light enters in long, dusty beams, shifting slowly through the hours of the day, the quality of the illumination changing from the cool blue of morning to the warm gold of afternoon to the soft amber of evening. It is a building that seems to breathe, that seems to be doing something gentle and ongoing with the light that enters it, something that no words quite capture, but that visitors have been feeling and failing to describe for 4.5 centuries. Suleiman himself was a man of genuine literary cultivation. He wrote poetry in the classical Ottoman style, under the pen name Muhibbi, meaning the affectionate, and his verses have a quality of personal feeling not always found in the formal court poetry of the period. A melancholy awareness of the passage of time, of the weight of power and its loneliness, of the distance between what one desires and what one possesses. He ruled the largest empire in the world and wrote poems about the fragility of human happiness. This is not a contradiction but a completeness, the kind of completeness that belongs to people who have seen enough of the world to understand both its grandeur and its sorrow. His relationship with his chief minister, Ibrahim Pasha, who served as Grand Vizier from 1523 to 1536, was one of the most significant political partnerships of the era, a relationship of genuine closeness and mutual trust between sultan and subject that shaped the governance of the empire for over a decade. Ibrahim was a man of Greek origin who had entered the Ottoman system through the Devshirme, risen through ability and personal connection with Suleiman to the highest position a subject could occupy, and used that position to manage the empire's affairs with considerable skill. His execution in 1536, ordered by Suleiman in a night of quiet decision whose exact reasons have been debated by historians ever since, was a reminder of the absolute nature of Ottoman power, that even the closest friend, the most trusted servant, existed at the Sultan's will, and could be removed by it, without appeal, without ceremony, in the early hours of a March morning in the palace that looked out over the dark water of the Bosphorus. The later years of Suleiman's reign had a different quality from the confident expansion of the earlier decades. The empire was fully formed, its boundaries more or less established, its institutions mature. The challenge was no longer building but maintaining, not expansion but administration, the thousand unglamorous daily tasks of keeping a vast and complex state functioning. Suleiman spent these years in the palace more than in the field, managing the increasingly complex politics of his court, the rivalries of factions, the question of succession among his sons that would, as it always did in the Ottoman system, produce tragedy. He did take the field one last time, in 1566, leading his army against the Habsburg-held fortress of Székesfehérvár in Hungary. He was 71 years old, or thereabouts, and in poor health, and the campaign moved slowly across the Hungarian landscape in the summer heat. The siege of Székesfehérvár was still in progress when Suleiman died in his tent on the 5th of September, in the early hours of the morning, quietly, as old men do when they have come to the end of their long road. The news of his death was kept secret from the army for a time, to prevent disruption, while the campaign was concluded and arrangements were made for the orderly transition of power. His body was carried back to Istanbul, back to the great city he had shaped and adorned, and buried in a mausoleum adjacent to the mosque that bore his name, beneath the dome that Sinan had built for the ages, in the soft and permanent shadow of the thing he had made. The empire he left behind was vast and complex and still powerful, still one of the dominant forces in the known world. Its coasts touched the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Its armies could project force from Central Europe to the Persian highlands. Its merchants and its pilgrims moved along routes that connected a dozen different civilizations. Its cities were full of learning and commerce, and the mixed, layered life of a truly cosmopolitan civilization. It had been, in the long span of Sulayman's reign, something genuinely extraordinary, not merely a military or political power, but a civilization in the fullest sense, a way of organizing human life and human culture across a vast and diverse territory that had its own coherence, its own beauty, its own unhurried sense of what it meant to live well in the world. And yet even then, in those last quiet years of Sulayman's reign, there were signs that the world was changing in ways that would gradually alter the empire's position within it. The Portuguese sea routes to Asia were beginning to divert some of the eastern trade away from the overland routes through Ottoman territory. The silver from the mines of the New World was beginning to reach the Mediterranean economy, gently inflating prices and disrupting the patterns of commerce that the empire's fiscal system depended upon. The Habsburg dynasty, bloodied but not broken, was rebuilding its military capabilities with a patient attention to new technologies of fortification and gunnery. These were slow pressures, gradual shifts, nothing that announced itself dramatically in any single year. But they were real, and they were accumulating, the way most consequential changes accumulate, quietly, at the edges of awareness, in the background of the daily life of an empire too large and too complex to notice every subtle alteration in the conditions that sustained it. The hills of Anatolia still held the afternoon light as they always had. The minarets of Istanbul still called the faithful to prayer 5 times each day, their voices rising and falling over the rooftops and the water, the sound spreading outward in rings of diminishing intensity, like circles on the surface of a still pond when a single drop of water has fallen into it. The empire breathed in and breathed out, vast and patient, still at what might have seemed its peak, still fully itself, still the confident center of the world it had built around itself over 2.5 centuries of gradual, unhurried becoming. There is a particular stillness that settles over a great palace in the hours before dawn. The corridors are quiet, the marble floors cool beneath the darkness, the lamps burning low in their niches along the walls, casting a soft and wavering light that moves with the faint draft that always seems to find its way through even the most carefully sealed chambers. In these hours, the vast structure seems to breathe on its own, independent of the thousands of people who sleep within its walls and courtyards, as if the palace itself were a living thing, something ancient and patient and aware, holding its memories in its stones the way old trees hold their years in their rings. This is Topkapi, the great palace on the promontory above the Bosphorus, the place where the Ottoman sultans lived and ruled and dreamed and grew old, the physical center of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Nile, from the Adriatic to the Persian highlands. To understand the Ottoman Empire is, in some essential way, to understand this palace, its spaces and its silences, its hierarchies and its rituals, the slow and elaborate choreography of daily life within its walls. Topkapi was not built all at once. It grew, as the empire grew, gradually and organically, each reign adding something, a new courtyard, a new pavilion, a new suite of rooms, so that the palace became, over the centuries, an accumulation of additions and modifications that reflected the particular preoccupations and tastes of each sultan in turn. Maimed II began its construction in the 1460s, choosing the promontory at the tip of the old city, where the waters of the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara all came together, a location of extraordinary natural beauty and considerable strategic sense, the water visible in three directions from the highest points of the palace grounds, the city spread below and around it like a cloak. The first structures were relatively simple, functional, the working buildings of an active administration. But over the following decades and centuries, the palace became something more, a city within the city, a world contained within its walls, with its own rhythms and its own logic and its own peculiar, elaborate way of being. The palace was organized around a series of courtyards, each more restricted and more sacred than the last, the progression from the outer gate to the innermost chambers a kind of gradual ascent into intimacy with power. The first courtyard, large and open, was accessible to anyone, merchants, petitioners, foreign visitors, the ordinary people of Istanbul going about the business that occasionally brought them to the palace precinct. It held the kitchens, enormous complexes of domed buildings where hundreds of cooks prepared food for the thousands of people who lived and worked within the palace. The smoke from the kitchen, fires rising in soft columns above the tiled rooftops through all hours of the day. It held the imperial mint and the armory and the outer hospital and the stables, the working infrastructure of the imperial household, arranged around the open grass of the courtyard, with a practical orderliness that contrasted pleasantly with the more ceremonial spaces further within. The second courtyard was more guarded, more formal, the space where the business of governance was most visibly conducted. The great council chamber, the divan, stood here, a graceful building with a tall chimney above its central room, its interior fitted with low benches where the Grand Vizier and the other senior ministers of state would gather several times a week to hear cases, receive petitions, debate matters of policy, and manage the administrative affairs of an empire that generated, even in its quietest periods, a continuous flow of correspondence and dispute and decision that required attention. The Sultan would sometimes watch the proceedings of the divan from behind a grilled window high in the wall, invisible to those below, listening to the business of his empire with the patient attention of a ruler who understood that governance was primarily a matter of information, of knowing what was happening across a vast and diverse territory and responding to it with appropriate steadiness. The third courtyard was the heart of the palace, the most restricted space, entry to which was permitted only to those with specific roles within the imperial household. It held the throne room, where the Sultan received foreign ambassadors and senior officials in formal audience, a chamber of considerable splendor fitted with a great canopied throne and hung with silks and decorated with tiles and calligraphy, designed to convey in the most immediate sensory terms the wealth and confidence and enduring permanence of the Ottoman state. It also held the treasury, where the accumulated wealth of the empire was stored, jewels and robes and weapons and gifts from foreign rulers, layer upon layer of material luxury gathered over centuries, the physical residue of a civilization's long prosperity. And beyond the third courtyard, through carefully guarded gates, lay the harem, perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the Ottoman palace world, a place about which so many fantasies and misrepresentations have accumulated in the centuries, since that it requires particular patience to see it clearly, to let its actual nature emerge from beneath the layers of imagination that have been applied to it. The harem, the word means, simply, the forbidden or the sacred, was the private residential quarters of the imperial household. It was a large complex of rooms and corridors, gardens and bathhouses, reception halls and sleeping chambers, inhabited by hundreds of people. The Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, who occupied the most prestigious position within the harem hierarchy. The Sultan's wives and concubines, women who had come from many different backgrounds and who existed within an elaborate social structure with its own protocols and its own politics. The children of the imperial household, princes and princesses educated within the harem's walls, and the many enslaved women who served the household, some of whom might over time rise to positions of considerable influence and comfort. The whole complex was supervised by a hierarchy of administrators and was guarded by eunuchs, men who served as the interface between the all-female world of the harem and the male world of the outer palace. Life in the harem had a quality that was at once deeply confined and within its confines, quite fully elaborated. The physical spaces were beautiful. The tilework of the harem chambers, particularly those renovated and expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, represents some of the finest decorative art produced anywhere in the Ottoman world. Walls covered in patterns of blue and white, and turquoise ceramic that seemed to breathe with their own gentle life. Flowers and geometric patterns interlacing in the soft light that came through latticed windows. The gardens of the harem, small and enclosed, had the intimate quality of spaces designed for quiet rather than for display, with fountains whose sound was ever present but never intrusive, a gentle background of moving water against which the day's events arranged themselves. The women who lived within the harem brought to it languages and customs from across the wide world from which the Ottoman imperial household drew its human material. Many of the imperial concubines were women who had come, through one route or another, from the Caucasus, from Georgia and Circassia, regions that sent women to the Ottoman court as gifts and as slaves across many generations. Others came from the Balkans, from North Africa, from the Mediterranean islands. Each brought with her the particular inheritance of her origin, her language, her sense of beauty, her cooking knowledge, her music, the stories and songs that her own mother had taught her. The harem was, in this sense, one of the most genuinely cosmopolitan spaces in the entire empire, a place where the cultural diversity of Ottoman territories was concentrated and held in close proximity, the different traditions brushing against each other in the daily life of shared quarters and shared kitchens and shared gardens. The political significance of the harem should not be underestimated, though it is also easy to overestimate it in the wrong direction. The women of the imperial household, particularly the mother of the reigning sultan, could wield very considerable influence over the affairs of the empire. The Valide Sultan occupied a position of formal prestige and informal power that made her one of the most important figures in the entire Ottoman system. She had her own income, her own household, her own capacity to commission buildings and endow charitable foundations, her own networks of communication with provincial governors and foreign powers. The period known to historians as the Sultanate of Women, roughly spanning the late 16th and early 17th centuries, was a time when a succession of forceful and capable women exercised significant influence over the affairs of the empire through their relationships with sultans who were sometimes young, sometimes weak, sometimes more interested in the pleasures of palace life than in the demanding work of governance. Hurrem Sultan, known in European sources as Roxolana, was perhaps the most famous of these women, and her story has a quality of quiet intensity that historical distance has only softened slightly. She had come to the palace as a young enslaved woman, likely of Ruthenian or Polish origin, and had risen through the harem hierarchy to become the favorite of Suleiman the Magnificent, and in a development that was genuinely unusual in Ottoman practice, his legal wife, the first concubine to be formally married to an Ottoman sultan in many generations. Her influence over Suleiman was considerable and enduring. She bore him several sons. She corresponded with foreign rulers. She commissioned charitable foundations, including a large complex in Istanbul and another in Jerusalem. She was a figure of genuine intelligence and considerable political acumen, navigating the complex world of the harem and the outer court with a patience and skill that made her, for many years, one of the most effective political actors in the empire. But let us step back from the individual stories, as compelling as they are, and return to the broader quality of life within the palace, the daily rhythms, the textures and sensations of existence in that elaborate enclosed world. The palace day was organized by prayer, as all life in the Ottoman world was. The call to dawn prayer, the Fajr, rose in the darkness before first light, the muezzin's voice from the minarets within the palace precinct moving through the still air, finding its way into the sleeping chambers where the sultan and the household lay in the last depths of night's quiet. The day opened from there, slowly, as days in a palace do. The morning ablutions, the preparation of food, the gathering of the household for the first meals, the beginning of the flow of petitions and correspondence and administrative business that would continue through the daylight hours. The Sultan's day, insofar as we can reconstruct it from the accounts of observers and the records of the palace administration, had a quality of elaborate ritual at every point. The business of dressing, of eating, of receiving visitors, all of it was conducted according to protocols that had developed over generations, each gesture and sequence laden with the accumulated significance of precedent and tradition. Even the preparation of the Sultan's food was subject to elaborate precautions, the ingredients inspected, the dishes tested, the whole process managed by a staff of specialized cooks organized in a hierarchy that mirrored the hierarchy of the palace itself. The anxiety about food and poison that these precautions reflected was not merely ceremonial. Ottoman history contained enough examples of political violence, enough of the lethal competitions that surrounded the Sultanate, to make caution in this area entirely rational. Food in the palace was a matter of considerable elaboration and cultural significance. The imperial kitchens produced a cuisine of great diversity and refinement, drawing on the culinary traditions of all the territories the empire encompassed. The spiced rice dishes and slow-cooked lamb preparations of Anatolian tradition, the vegetable dishes of the Levant, the fish preparations of the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts, the pastries and sweets that drew on both the Persian and the Turkic traditions of the early Ottoman inheritance. Coffee, which had become widely available in the empire during the 16th century, after its gradual diffusion northward from Yemen through Arabia and Egypt, was by Suleiman's time an established presence in palace life. The dark, bitter drink prepared in small copper vessels over careful heat, poured into tiny cups, and consumed slowly in the intervals between the business of governance, a warm and aromatic pause in the long day's work. The palace also had its own culture of music and poetry, woven through daily life in ways both formal and informal. Ottoman classical music, with its intricate modal system and its preference for melody over harmony, for the gradual, patient exploration of a single melodic mode across the length of a long composition, was cultivated at court with the same careful attention that was given to architecture and poetry and calligraphy. The palace employed musicians of several kinds, those who performed at formal ceremonial occasions, those who played for the private pleasure of the sultan and the household, those who participated in the religious ceremonies that punctuated the palace calendar. The instruments of Ottoman classical music, the oud, the ney flute with its breathy and contemplative voice, the canon zither with its dense cascade of strings, the kemen's fiddle with its high, thin tone, produced a music that was at once sophisticated and intimate, complex in its theoretical foundations, but intended always for careful, quiet listening rather than spectacle. Poetry was perhaps even more central than music to the cultural life of the court. The Ottoman literary tradition, drawing on the Persian classical tradition while developing its own distinctive character, produced across the 15th and 16th centuries a body of poetry of considerable beauty and range, love poems and mystical verses, panegyrics in praise of sultans and elegies for the dead, philosophical meditations on the nature of time and beauty, and the distance between the human and the divine. The great poets of the classical period, Fuseli, who wrote in 3 languages and produced some of the most emotionally resonant verse of the era, Baki, whose poems have a quality of polished, lapidary beauty like smooth stone beneath the hand, Nedim, who came somewhat later and brought to the tradition a lighter, more worldly tone, were figures of real cultural prestige. Their works circulated in manuscript across the empire, read and memorized and discussed in coffee houses and palaces alike. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, occupied a special place in the visual culture of the palace and the empire. The Arabic script in which Ottoman Turkish was written lent itself to a range of calligraphic styles, from the large, bold thuluth used for architectural inscription to the smaller, more flowing naskh of manuscripts, to the compressed and elegant tallic used for Persian-influenced verse. The great calligraphers of the Ottoman tradition, Sheikh Hamdullah in the early period, Hafiz Osman in the 17th century, were revered figures, their work collected and preserved with the care given to the productions of master painters in other traditions. A beautifully written page of Quran, or a choice verse of poetry rendered in a fine hand, was an object of genuine aesthetic pleasure, something to be looked at slowly, the eye moving along the curves and angles of the letterforms, with the same unhurried attention that one might give to a landscape scene through a window in the morning light. The palace also had its school, the Enderun, the institution through which the most talented of the Devshirme boys were given an education designed to produce the highest levels of Ottoman administration. The Enderun was essentially a training ground for excellence. Young men selected for intelligence and aptitude were educated in languages, in Islamic learning, in the arts and sciences, in physical skills including horsemanship and archery, in the complex protocols of Ottoman court life, and gradually, over many years, advanced through a series of positions within the palace household that gave them practical experience of administration. Those who performed best rose eventually to the highest offices of the state, to provincial governorships, to the position of Grand Vizier itself. This system produced, across many generations, a remarkably capable administrative class, men who combined theoretical education with practical experience, who understood the empire from the inside in the most literal sense, having grown up within its central institution. It is worth pausing to consider the Grand Vizier, the chief minister who in many periods effectively governed the empire on the Sultan's behalf. The position of Grand Vizier was one of the most powerful in the world during the centuries of Ottoman dominance. A man who could make war and peace, appoint and dismiss officials across a vast territory, manage the complex machinery of imperial finance and military organization, conduct diplomacy with foreign powers, and shape the daily functioning of the state. He was, in theory, entirely subject to the Sultan's will, holding his position at the Sultan's pleasure and removable at any moment by the Sultan's command. And this was not merely theory. Grand Viziers were indeed removed, and sometimes executed, with a frequency that makes the position seem almost dangerous to occupy. Yet within these constraints, the best Grand Viziers exercised a degree of independent judgment and practical authority that made them genuinely consequential historical figures in their own right. The Kerpulu family, which provided several Grand Viziers in the late 17th century, is perhaps the most striking example, a dynasty of administrators who stabilized and to some degree revitalized the empire at a moment when it had seemed to be drifting, bringing a quality of energetic competence to the management of state affairs that temporarily arrested the long, gradual processes of institutional strain that had been accumulating since Suleiman's time. Kerpulu Mehmed Pasha, the first of the family to hold the position, was appointed in 1656 at an advanced age by a sultan and a court desperate for capable leadership, and he proceeded to impose order on the imperial administration with a firmness that some found harsh but that most recognized as necessary. He died in office in 1661, having restored a measure of stability, and was succeeded by his son Fazil Ahmed Pasha, who continued his father's work with perhaps somewhat more refinement and less severity. The relationship between the Sultan and the Grand Vizier varied enormously depending on the personalities involved and the particular circumstances of the moment. Some sultans were energetic and engaged, involved in every significant decision, present at military campaigns, active in the management of their court and their administration. Others preferred to withdraw from the visible exercise of power, leaving day-to-day governance to the Grand Vizier, while they devoted themselves to the pleasures and quieter pursuits available within the palace walls. Neither mode was inherently superior. An energetic sultan could be decisive and inspiring, but also impulsive and disruptive, while a more withdrawn sultan could allow capable ministers the space to govern effectively even as he created the conditions for the kind of factional intrigue that thrived in the absence of strong central authority. The later 16th century saw the beginning of what historians call the cage, a practice by which princes of the imperial family, the Sultan's brothers and half-brothers who under the older Ottoman system would have been killed upon the accession of a new sultan to prevent civil war among competing claimants, were instead confined within a special section of the harem, the caves, and kept there, alive but isolated for years or decades, cut off from any meaningful contact with the outside world. It was a solution to one problem that created other problems. Princes who had spent their formative years in the caves, with no experience of administration or warfare, no education in the practical demands of governance, no opportunity to develop the networks and relationships that rulers need, sometimes emerged upon accession to the throne, when an older brother died without male heirs, poorly equipped for the enormous demands of the position. The practice contributed to what some historians have described as the weakening of the Sultanate in the 17th century, a gradual diminishment in the practical competence and personal authority of individual sultans that opened space for other power centers. The Janissaries, the harem, the senior officials, to exercise increasing influence over the affairs of the empire. The Janissaries, those elite infantry soldiers who had been such a central element of Ottoman military success since the early centuries of the empire, had by the 17th century evolved into something quite different from what they had originally been. The Devshirme system that had produced them, the periodic levy of Christian boys from the Balkan provinces, had by this period effectively ended, and the Janissary Corps had become a hereditary institution, with Janissaries passing their status to their sons, forming an entrenched military caste with its own interests and its own political weight. They had become involved in the commerce of Istanbul, with many Janissaries running businesses in the city's markets, their military identity becoming in practice secondary to their economic and social roles. And they had demonstrated, on several occasions across the 17th century, a willingness to depose sultans who displeased them, a capacity for political violence directed upward against the very apex of the Ottoman hierarchy that represented a profound alteration in the empire's internal balance of power. The palace watched all of this from behind its walls, from behind its latticed windows and its guarded gates, with the patient anxiety of an institution that understood its own vulnerability, even as it projected outward the symbols of unassailable authority. The great ceremonies of the Ottoman court, the processions of the Sultan through the city on holy days, the formal receptions of foreign ambassadors, the dispensing of justice in the divan, maintained their elaborate protocols, their careful choreographies of precedence and display, even as the realities of power shifted and adjusted in ways that the ceremonies were not designed to acknowledge. There is something touching about this, the insistence on the forms of authority even when the substance was contested, the maintenance of the rituals that had always expressed the Ottoman claim to be the center of a divinely ordered world. But even in its complexity and its slow internal tensions, the palace remained a place of genuine beauty and genuine cultural richness through these centuries. The tilework added to the harem in the late 16th century, under Murad II, is among the most beautiful decorative work ever produced in the Ottoman tradition. Walls of the Iznik tile workshop's finest output, the flowers and arabesques rendered in colors of impossible freshness, blues and greens and reds that have kept their vibrancy across 4.5 centuries in the slow light of those interior spaces. The library that Ahmed III built within the third courtyard in the early 18th century is a small jewel of a building, refined and intimate, a place designed for the quiet pleasure of reading, its shelves once holding manuscripts of extraordinary quality and variety. The marble terrace, the pool and the pavilions that look out over the Bosphorus from the palace's seaward edge, is a space of such calm loveliness that visitors have been stopping there to simply look at the water for 500 years, drawn by the same quality that drew the sultans who first created it, the particular piece of a beautiful view seen from a comfortable and sheltered position, the world spread out before you at a manageable distance, the water moving below with its eternal patient indifference to human affairs. The view from the marble terrace is worth dwelling on a moment longer because it captures something essential about the Ottoman palace experience. The way the interior world of the palace, with all its hierarchies and rituals and political tensions, was always in relationship with the larger world visible just beyond its walls. From this terrace, a sultan could look across the Bosphorus to the Asian shore, softly green and distant, the hills rising from the water's edge with a gentle unhurriedness that the water itself seemed to mirror. He could see the ships moving through the strait, the merchant vessels from the Black Sea ports laden with grain and timber, the small fishing boats that worked the productive waters close to shore, the occasional naval galley moving with its measured oar-strokes through the current. He could see the minarets of the mosques on both shores, their white fingers rising against the sky at the times of prayer. And here, if the wind was right, the sound of the call drifting across the water with its ancient melodic formula that had not changed in any essential way since the earliest days of Islam. This relationship between enclosure and vastness, between the intimate world of the palace interior and the enormous world of the empire beyond, was something that the greatest Ottoman sultans seemed to have understood and held in balance. The need to be present within the palace, to tend to its complex life and politics, and the need also to look outward, to maintain awareness of and connection with the enormous, diverse, living reality of the empire that the palace served, and that sustained the palace in return. The balance was never perfectly maintained. There were sultans who lost themselves in the pleasures of palace life and lost touch with the world beyond its walls. And there were sultans who were so consumed with military campaigning and the larger affairs of empire that they neglected the palace politics, that then created problems in their absence. But the ideal was always there, the ruler as the still point at the center of a turning world, present and aware, patient and watchful, holding the threads of an immense and complex civilization in steady, unhurried hands. And so the palace breathed through the centuries, its life continuous and slow, the generations succeeding one another within its walls, while the empire it served expanded and contracted and evolved around it. Sultans were born and raised and educated and crowned and grew old and died within sight of the same waters, the same hills, the same turning sky above the dome of Hagia Sophia that rose above the rooftops a short distance away. The stones of the palace absorbed the warmth of 200 summers and held it through the cool of 200 autumns. The gardens grew and were tended and grew again. The fountains ran their quiet, continuous music through the nights when everything else was still. And in the hours before dawn, when the corridors were quiet and the lamps burned low, the palace was simply itself, ancient and patient and full of everything that had happened within its walls and everything that was still, slowly, quietly to come. There is a particular quality to an afternoon that has passed its peak. The light still warm, still golden, still flooding the landscape with a generous and unhurried radiance, but carrying within it now the first faint suggestion of evening, the earliest intimation that the day, for all its beauty, will not last forever. The shadows are a little longer than they were at midday, the air a little softer, the quality of stillness a little deeper, as if the world itself is beginning, very gently, to exhale. This is the afternoon that the Ottoman Empire inhabited across the 17th and 18th centuries, still vast, still wealthy, still possessed of a civilization of genuine depth and complexity and beauty, but moving, with the slow and almost imperceptible certainty of the sun across the sky, toward a different kind of light. It would be a misreading of this period to see it simply as decline, as a story of loss and diminishment told against the brighter backdrop of what had come before. The Ottoman Empire of the 17th and 18th centuries was not a failed state or a collapsing civilization. It was a very large, very complex, very old institution navigating a world that was changing around it in ways that were genuinely difficult to perceive clearly from within the palace on the Bosphorus, let alone to respond to, with the kind of systematic adaptation that retrospect makes seem obvious and necessary. The changes happening in Europe during this period, the scientific revolution, the commercial revolution, the gradual development of new forms of military technology and organization and state finance, were not things that announced themselves with clarity even to Europeans living through them. They were understood only gradually, only partially, only in retrospect, as the accumulation of small shifts produced, over decades, a transformation that seemed sudden only because it had been invisible for so long. The year 1683 carries a particular weight in Ottoman history, not because it was a moment of catastrophic collapse, but because it marked the clearest point of turning, the moment when the long westward pressure of Ottoman military expansion reached its furthest extent and began, slowly and unevenly, to recede. In that summer, a great Ottoman army under the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha besieged Vienna for the second time. The first siege had been Suleiman's in 1529, and the memory of it had persisted in the European imagination for a century and a half, a reminder of the Ottoman world's capacity to project force deep into the European heartland. The 1683 siege was a substantial undertaking, the Ottoman army enormous by the standards of the time, the trenches and siege works extending in elaborate patterns across the fields and orchards that lay outside Vienna's walls, the summer heat pressing down on both sides with democratic indifference. But on the 12th of September, a relief army arrived, a combined force of Polish, German, and Austrian troops, commanded by the Polish King John III Sobieski, descending from the Kahlenberg Hills above the city with a speed that caught the Ottoman forces between two threats: the besieging army suddenly itself under pressure from without while the Viennese defenders pushed from within. The Ottoman forces were defeated and withdrew, and the withdrawal, though orderly in its first stages, carried within it the seed of something more significant than a single military reversal. The Ottoman army did not return to the walls of Vienna. The westward movement had reached its limit and turned back, and over the following decade, under the pressure of a holy league that brought together Austria and Poland and Venice, and the papacy in a sustained military coalition, Ottoman forces were pushed back from positions in Hungary and the Balkans that they had held for more than a century. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized these losses and was itself something new in Ottoman experience, a peace treaty negotiated from a position of weakness, a document in which the empire acknowledged the permanent loss of significant territories to Christian powers for the first time in its history. Hungary, which had been under Ottoman control in large portions since the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, passed to Habsburg authority. The Peloponnese in southern Greece went temporarily to Venice. Podolia in what is now Ukraine went to Poland. These were not peripheral territories. They were places that the Ottoman state had administered for generations, places with Ottoman mosques and Ottoman markets and Ottoman administrative traditions, places where the long, slow accumulation of Ottoman civilization had left its marks in the built environment and the social fabric. The loss was absorbed, as large losses by large states are absorbed, gradually, imperfectly, with varying degrees of understanding of what had actually happened and what it implied. There were those within the Ottoman system who recognized clearly that something fundamental had shifted, that the empire now faced challenges that required systematic responses rather than the patient application of traditional methods. And there were those who understood the losses primarily in terms of the specific military and administrative failures that had produced them. Failures of leadership, of logistics, of tactical decision-making, rather than as symptoms of deeper structural conditions. The Kerpulu Grand Viziers of the second half of the 17th century had already demonstrated that capable, energetic administration could arrest and even temporarily reverse the processes of institutional strain that had been accumulating since Suleiman's time. Kerpulu Fazil Mustafa Pasha, who served as Grand Vizier from 1689 to 1691, managed to stabilize the military situation somewhat and began to look at structural reforms with a practical eye, before his death in battle cut short what might have been a more sustained reform effort. This pattern of capable individuals identifying problems and beginning to address them, only to be removed by death or political circumstance before their work could be completed, would repeat itself across the 18th century with a gentle, almost melancholy regularity, each reforming impulse interrupted before it could fully transform the system it was trying to change. The 18th century in the Ottoman world has, in retrospect, a quality of genuine intellectual and cultural ferment that is sometimes obscured by the political and military narrative of territorial pressure and institutional strain. It was not a static or stagnant period. There were sultans and viziers and officials who read carefully, who thought seriously about the empire's situation, who looked at the European powers that were increasingly pressing on the empire's edges, and asked themselves what those powers were doing differently, and whether Ottoman institutions could be adapted to incorporate some of what was working well in those different systems. These questions were asked carefully, with the awareness that the empire's identity was deeply bound up with its Islamic character and its Ottoman traditions. That change which appeared to undermine these foundations would face resistance not merely from vested interests, but from a genuine cultural conviction about the proper ordering of the world. Ahmed III, who ruled from 1703 to 1730, presided over a period that has come to be called the Tulip Era, a name derived from the extraordinary fashion for tulip cultivation that swept through the Ottoman elite in these years, particularly in Istanbul, where the great households competed to produce the most elaborate and varied tulip gardens, the flowers bred in thousands of varieties, their names as elaborate and poetic as the flowers themselves. The tulip had long been a significant flower in Ottoman decorative tradition. It appeared in the tilework of mosques and the patterns of textiles and the designs of ceramic ware across many generations. But in the tulip era, it became something more, a symbol of a particular cultural moment, of a society sufficiently at ease with itself to turn its attention to beauty and pleasure and the careful cultivation of lovely things. Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier Nevshehili Damat Ibrahim Pasha presided over this flowering with a cultivated and genuine enthusiasm. They built gardens and pleasure pavilions along the shores of the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus. The Sadabad complex, inspired in part by the formal gardens of Versailles that Ottoman ambassadors had visited and reported on with careful admiration, was laid out along a small stream that had been redirected and regularized for the purpose. Its banks lined with pavilions and kiosks where the court could spend the long summer evenings in the pleasures of music and poetry, and the contemplation of their extraordinary tulip collections. These gatherings had an almost dreamlike quality in the accounts that survive of them. The flowers lit by thousands of small lamps after dark, their petals glowing softly in the artificial light, tortoises with candles fixed to their shells moving slowly among the flower beds, the music of the palace musicians drifting across the water, the whole scene a kind of living poem about the beauty of the passing moment. The tulip era also saw the first Ottoman printing press, established for secular publications, a development of genuine long-term significance that unfolded with the characteristic Ottoman gradualism of the period. Ibrahim Mutafarika, a Hungarian convert to Islam of considerable intellectual breadth, established a press in Istanbul in 1727 with official permission, and produced over the following years a series of printed books covering geography, history, language, and other subjects. The press was welcomed in some quarters and regarded with caution in others. The religious establishment had long maintained that the Quran and religious texts should not be printed, a position that was respected, and that limited the press's output to secular subjects. But the existence of the press at all was a quiet acknowledgement that the tools of knowledge production were changing, and that the Ottoman world could not indefinitely remain outside the transformation that print had already worked in European intellectual life. Ahmed III was deposed in 1730 in a Janissary revolt, the Patrona Halil uprising, named for its leader, a Greek-Albanian former sailor, who led a popular movement that drew on genuine grievances about taxation and military reverses, but also reflected the resistance of the more traditional elements of Ottoman society to the cultural experimentation of the tulip era. The Sadabad pleasure complex was dismantled. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha was killed. Ahmed III was replaced by his nephew Mahmud I, and the particular cultural moment of the tulip era passed, as such moments do, leaving behind it a changed landscape. The printing press survived. The architectural experiments of the period left their mark on the Istanbul skyline. But the easy confidence, the willingness to play with ideas and forms and flowers in the long afternoon of the empire, had a quality that would not quite be recaptured in the same way. Mahmud I and his successors through the 18th century faced the continuing pressure of the two great powers that flanked the empire to the north and the northeast, the Habsburg Empire of Austria, and, increasingly, the Russian Empire under its energetic and expansionist rulers. Russia in particular was emerging as a new and formidable presence in the regions adjacent to Ottoman territory. Peter the Great had already demonstrated in the early decades of the century that Russia was capable of sustained military modernization along European lines, and his successors continued this transformation. The Ottoman Empire and Russia fought a series of wars across the 18th century, in 1710 to 1711, in 1735 to 1739, in 1768 to 1774, in 1787 to 1792, each of which produced mixed results but a general tendency toward Ottoman concession in the regions where the two empires pressed against each other, particularly around the Black Sea and in the Crimea, and in the territories along the Danube. The Treaty of Kusuk-Kainarka in 1774, which ended the War of 1768 to 1774, was one of those documents whose consequences extended far beyond its specific territorial provisions. Russia gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, an opening that would be used as a pretext for intervention in Ottoman affairs across the following century. The Crimea, which had been under Ottoman suzerainty since the 15th century, was declared independent, a status that proved temporary, as Russia annexed it outright in 1783 without significant Ottoman resistance. The Black Sea, which had for centuries been effectively an Ottoman lake, with the empire controlling virtually all of its coastline, was now open to Russian shipping, fundamentally altering the strategic and commercial geography of the region. These losses were real and significant, and they were understood as such by thoughtful observers within the Ottoman system. But the response to them was not despair or passivity. The latter decades of the 18th century saw a series of reform efforts, tentative, partial, contested, but genuine, that reflected a growing awareness within the Ottoman governing class that the empire's traditional military and administrative systems were not well suited to the challenges it now faced. Ottoman commanders who had fought against European armies observed carefully the differences in training and tactics and equipment that made European forces increasingly effective. Ottoman officials who dealt with European diplomats and read European reports were aware, at least in outline, of the transformations in state organization and finance and technology that were reshaping European power. Selim III, who came to the throne in 1789, the same year that the French Revolution began its turbulent transformation of European political life, was perhaps the most sustained and serious reformer the empire had seen since the early centuries. He was a man of genuine cultural sensitivity, a composer of some ability who left behind a small body of musical compositions that have been preserved and performed by later generations. A reader and a thinker who had corresponded with foreign rulers before his accession and had thought carefully about the empire's situation. His reform program, which he called the Nizam Letter 131 Sadid, meaning the New Order, aimed to create a new army trained and equipped on European lines alongside the existing Janissary Corps, not replacing the Janissaries directly, which would have provoked immediate resistance, but building a parallel military capacity that would demonstrate the superiority of modern training and gradually provide an alternative foundation for Ottoman military power. The Nizam Letter 131 Sadid troops were trained by European instructors, equipped with modern weapons, drilled in the tactical formations that European armies had developed across a century of intensive warfare. They were funded by a new treasury established separately from the main imperial finances, supported by carefully maintained revenue streams. In the years of their existence, they showed genuine promise, performing creditably in engagements against Russian forces and demonstrating that Ottoman soldiers trained in modern methods could be effective by the standards of the time. The experiment was real, and its results were encouraging. But it was not allowed to continue. In 1807, a combination of forces and conservative elements within the religious establishment who viewed the new order as a dangerous importation of foreign ways, Janissaries who understood correctly that a successful modern army would ultimately mean the end of their own privileged position, provincial power brokers who resented the centralizing tendencies of the reform program, rose against Selim and forced him to dissolve the Nizam Letter 131 Sadid. He was deposed and imprisoned, and the following year, when a loyalist attempt to restore him was made, he was killed within the palace, his body left in a courtyard to be discovered by his would-be rescuers when they arrived too late. He died as he had lived, quietly, within the palace walls, a thoughtful man whose vision had been genuine but whose moment had not been quite ready for him. His successor Mustafa IV was himself replaced almost immediately by Mahmud II, who would prove to be the most consequential reforming sultan of the 19th century, though his most significant reforms came later. In the immediate aftermath of the turbulent events of 1807 and 1808, Mahmud had to consolidate his position carefully, patiently, navigating the complex politics of a court and empire still unsettled by the upheavals of the preceding years. He was a man of considerable personal determination and political intelligence, capable of waiting for the right moment with a patience that his predecessors had not always possessed, and the first 2 decades of his reign were spent in the gradual, careful work of re-establishing central authority over provincial powers that had grown increasingly autonomous during the periods of weakness and distraction. The empire of the late 18th century was not simply a central government in Istanbul, with provinces that obediently followed its direction. It was a complex landscape of overlapping authorities, of provincial governors who had built their own power bases and sometimes transmitted their positions to their sons, of local notables who mediated between Istanbul and the village world they knew, of tribal leaders whose authority rested on entirely different foundations from those of Ottoman administration, of religious institutions with their own resources and their own claims on the loyalty of the population. Managing this landscape required something more nuanced than simple command. It required negotiation, accommodation, the patient working of relationships that were never simply hierarchical, but always embedded in local conditions and local histories. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821 and concluded in 1830 with the formal recognition of a Greek state, was a development of considerable significance. The first successful separatist movement within the Ottoman Empire to achieve its goals through a combination of military resistance and international support. The Greek uprising had complex roots, the long tradition of Greek Orthodox Christian identity that had been maintained through the Millet system, the influence of European Enlightenment ideas about nationhood and self-determination that had reached educated Greeks through the networks of the Greek merchant diaspora in Europe, the specific grievances of various Greek communities within the Ottoman world. The war itself was fought with the desperate intensity that such conflicts carry, producing suffering on multiple sides, atrocities that neither party could be proud of in retrospect. The whole tragic human cost that accompanies the violent reorganization of political arrangements that have persisted for generations. The international dimension was crucial. Britain and France and Russia intervened, ultimately, on the Greek side, their fleets destroying the Ottoman Egyptian naval force at the Battle of Navarino in 1827, in an engagement that effectively decided the maritime dimension of the conflict. That the great powers of Europe would intervene militarily within Ottoman territory on behalf of a Christian separatist movement was itself a significant development, a demonstration that the international environment surrounding the empire had changed fundamentally from the days when even the most powerful European states had treated the Ottomans as a necessary and sovereign player in the European state system. The empire's vulnerability to external pressure, particularly when that pressure was accompanied by appeals to the sympathies of the European public, had been demonstrated clearly, and the demonstration would be remembered. And yet, through all of this, through the military reversals and the territorial losses, and the internal political turbulence, and the reform efforts interrupted and resumed and interrupted again, the daily life of the empire continued with its characteristic mixture of persistence and adaptation. The markets of Istanbul and Cairo and Damascus and Aleppo still moved with the rhythms of commerce, still filled each morning with the sounds and smells of trade, the coffee roasting in the coffeehouse doorways, the bread baking in the ovens of the baker's quarter, the silks and cotton spread out on the merchants' shelves in the covered bazaars where the light came in through small round windows in the domed ceilings, falling in soft circles on the goods below. The mosques still held their congregations at prayer times, the sound of the call still rising and falling over the rooftops in the old melodic patterns, unchanged since the earliest days of Islam, connecting the present moment to a past of extraordinary depth and durability. The pilgrimage route still functioned, the great annual caravans making their long, slow way from Damascus and Cairo toward Mecca and Medina, carrying with them the pilgrims of many different backgrounds and many different languages who had traveled from the furthest corners of the empire to fulfill the obligation that their faith placed upon them. The caravans were enormous, thousands of people and animals moving through the desert landscape, the bells of the camels sounding through the nights, the stars of the Arabian sky vast and close overhead, the silence of the desert pressing in from all sides beyond the edge of firelight. The Ottoman state took its responsibility for the safety and provisioning of these caravans seriously, understanding that the protection of the pilgrimage routes was one of the most important symbolic functions of its claim to Islamic leadership. Fortresses and water cisterns had been built along the routes, maintained by the imperial administration, the practical infrastructure of piety that the empire provided as one of its most fundamental services to the Muslim world. The cultural life of the empire in the 18th century had its own distinctive character. Neither the confident flowering of the classical Suleymanic period nor the desperate urgency of later reform, but something more reflective, more self-aware, more tinged with the particular beauty that comes from an awareness of impermanence. The great poet Nedim, who wrote in the early 18th century and died in the Patrona Halil Revolt of 1730, brought to Ottoman poetry a quality of worldly sensuality and urban sophistication that felt new. He wrote about the pleasures of Istanbul, about wine and love, and the beauty of the Bosphorus in spring, with a directness and warmth that the more formal classical tradition had not typically permitted itself. His poems have an afternoon quality, a savoring of the present moment that is all the more poignant for the awareness, never quite stated, that the moment will pass. The Bosphorus itself, that narrow winding waterway that had always been central to Istanbul's identity and to the Ottoman Empire's strategic geography, was in the 18th century increasingly lined with wooden summer houses, the yalis, those elegant waterside mansions where the Ottoman elite spent the warmer months, watching the ships pass on the dark current, sleeping in the evenings to the sound of the water against the pilings below their windows, the night air cool and salt-scented from the sea. These buildings were things of considerable charm, their interiors painted with landscapes and flowers in a style that drew on both the Ottoman tradition and the European decorative fashion that were increasingly influential among the Istanbul elite, their gardens running down to the water's edge, their reception halls designed for the long summer evenings of music and conversation that were the particular pleasure of the Ottoman educated class. The water moved past these houses as it had always moved, indifferent to the beautiful buildings on its banks, indifferent to the empires that had claimed its shores, carrying its current steadily from the Black Sea to the Marmara, as it had since long before any human hand had built anything along its edges. The hills on either side caught the afternoon light and held it, their surfaces shifting through the hours from pale gold to deep amber to the soft rose of early evening, the colors moving across the landscape, with the unhurried certainty of the sun completing its daily arc. And in the late afternoon, when the light was at its most beautiful, when the whole scene had the quality of something almost dreamlike in its loveliness, the muezzin's call would rise from the minarets along the shore, the ancient formula drifting out over the water, marking the passage of the hours with its patient, recurring reminder that time moves always, that the day turns always toward evening, that all things beautiful and complex and enduring are also, in their own way and their own time, mortal. There is a particular kind of evening light that falls across old cities in the last hour before dark, a soft, diffuse radiance that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That makes the stones of ancient buildings glow with a warmth they have been absorbing all day and are now, slowly and generously, releasing back into the cooling air. It is a light that makes everything look both more beautiful and more fragile than it does at other times of day. A light that has within it an awareness of ending, of the slow and irreversible turning of the world away from the sun. Istanbul in the 19th century had this quality, still magnificent, still layered with the accumulated beauty of centuries, its skyline still one of the most extraordinary in the world, its markets still full, its streets still alive with the mixture of peoples and languages and customs that had always been its character. And yet something was shifting in the quality of the light. Something was changing in the long, slow relationship between this city and the empire it had served and embodied for 4 centuries. Something that no amount of architectural beauty or commercial vitality could quite conceal from those who looked carefully and honestly at what they saw. The 19th century was the century in which the Ottoman Empire confronted, with increasing directness and urgency, the question that had been forming slowly since at least the middle of the 17th century. The question of how a civilization built on one set of foundations could adapt to a world being rapidly reorganized around a very different set of foundations, without losing what was most essential about itself in the process. It was not a question with an easy answer. It may not have had an answer at all, in the sense of a solution that could have preserved the empire indefinitely while transforming it sufficiently to meet the new conditions. But the attempt to find such an answer, carried out across the 19th century with genuine seriousness and considerable human cost, is one of the most interesting and poignant chapters in the long story of the Ottoman world. Mahmud II, who had been waiting and preparing since his accession in 1808, finally made his decisive move in 1826. The Janissaries, those soldiers who had been central to Ottoman military power since the 14th century and who had become, over the intervening centuries, an entrenched and increasingly dysfunctional institution resistant to any reform that threatened their privileges, revolted against Mahmud's attempt to introduce new military training alongside their corps, as Selim III had attempted and failed to do a generation earlier. But Mahmud had prepared more carefully than Selim. He had secured the support of the religious establishment in advance, obtained a fatwa declaring the action against the Janissaries to be religiously legitimate, and positioned artillery around the Janissary barracks in Istanbul before the uprising could gather momentum. When the Janissaries overturned their soup cauldrons, the traditional signal of revolt, the response was swift. The barracks were bombarded. The Janissary Corps was dissolved, its members killed or dispersed, its soup cauldrons and distinctive headgear collected and destroyed, as if physically eliminating the symbols of the institution could help ensure that it would not reassemble itself from the memory of what it had been. Mahmud called this the auspicious incident, and the name captures the mixture of relief and cautious optimism with which the event was received by those who had long understood the Janissary Corps as the primary obstacle to the military and administrative reforms the empire needed. With the Janissaries gone, the path was open, or more open than it had been, for the reorganization of the army along modern European lines, for the introduction of new schools teaching European military sciences, for the slow and contested work of building different kinds of institutions on the ground where the old ones had stood. Mahmud pressed forward with characteristic determination, creating new military schools, sending young Ottoman officers to Europe to study, overhauling the central administration, attempting to establish more direct central control over provincial governance that had become, in some regions, effectively autonomous. He also changed the appearance of the Ottoman state in ways that were, in their own way, significant. The old system of different costumes for different ranks and religious communities, which had made Ottoman society legible to the eye, you could tell at a glance, from the color and shape of a man's headgear and the cut of his coat, something about his religion, his profession, his rank was modified. The fez, that cylindrical red felt cap without a brim that could be worn by Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and that did not interfere with the prostration in prayer as the brimmed hats of European fashion did, became the standard headgear for Ottoman officials and soldiers, replacing the turbans and other traditional coverings that had marked different communities and positions. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the context of the large challenges facing the empire, but it had a symbolic weight, a gesture toward a kind of standardized, legible modernity that the empire was attempting to project, a visual statement about the direction of change. Mahmud II died in 1839, before he could see whether the reforms he had set in motion would prove sufficient to the scale of the problems they were meant to address. He was succeeded by his son Abdulmesid I, a young man of more gentle temperament and genuine reforming conviction who, almost immediately upon his accession, issued a remarkable document, the Hat Letter 131 Sheriff of Gulhane, the noble rescript of the Rose Garden that inaugurated the period known as the Tanzimat, meaning literally the reorganization. The Gulhane rescript promised to all subjects of the empire, regardless of religion, the security of life and property, equality before the law, and fair and regular taxation. These were not merely rhetorical gestures, though they had a rhetorical dimension that was addressed partly at the European powers whose support the empire needed, and whose liberal political rhetoric the Ottomans were consciously engaging with. They were also the beginning of a serious and sustained legislative effort to reorganize the legal and administrative foundations of the Ottoman state on principles that were compatible with participation in the European international order. The Tanzimat period, which is generally understood to run from 1839 to 1876, produced a remarkable body of legislation and institutional change. New courts were established to handle commercial and criminal matters according to new legal codes inspired by French models. New schools were created, a hierarchy of primary and secondary schools intended to produce an educated citizenry capable of staffing the modernized bureaucracy that the reformed state required. Newspapers began to circulate in Ottoman Turkish and in the other languages of the empire, creating a new public sphere of information and discussion that had not previously existed in the same form. Telegraph lines were strung across the empire's territories, connecting the capital to distant provinces with a speed of communication that would have seemed almost impossible to earlier generations of Ottoman administrators who had relied on horses and ships to carry their messages. The railways began to come, slowly, the iron lines extending outward from the main cities, threading through the Anatolian and Balkan landscapes with the patient, transformative logic of infrastructure, altering the relationship between distance and time in ways that reorganized the economic and social geography of the regions they crossed. The architects of the Tanzimat, figures like Mustafa Reshid Pasha, who had served as ambassador to Europe and understood European political culture from direct experience, and Ali Pasha and Fuad Pasha, who carried the reform program forward through the middle decades of the century, were men of genuine ability and genuine conviction, working in conditions of great difficulty. The empire they were trying to reform was under continuous external pressure, from Russia to the north, from the Habsburg Empire to the west, from the growing independence movements in the Balkan provinces, from the European powers whose financial support the empire increasingly needed, but whose intervention in its internal affairs that support inevitably invited. Managing this external pressure while simultaneously trying to reorganize the internal structures of a very large and very complex state was a task of extraordinary difficulty, requiring a kind of patient, sustained attention to multiple dimensions of a problem simultaneously that few individuals or institutions can maintain indefinitely. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brought the empire into a formal military alliance with Britain and France against Russia, an alliance that produced a military outcome broadly favorable to the Ottoman position. Russia was checked. The Black Sea was temporarily neutralized as a zone of Russian naval power, but at considerable financial cost. The empire borrowed heavily from European banks to finance its participation in the war, and this borrowing was the beginning of a financial dependence on European capital that would deepen steadily across the following decades, becoming one of the central problems of the empire's later history. The interest payments on Ottoman foreign debt grew year by year, consuming an increasing share of the imperial budget, limiting the resources available for the investment in education and infrastructure and military modernization that the reform program required. It was a slow, financial pressure, less dramatic than military defeat, but in some ways more corrosive, a quiet erosion of the empire's capacity to act independently on its own behalf. The second great reform document of the period, the Hat Letter 131 Humayun of 1856, extended and deepened the promises of the Gulhane Rescript, explicitly guaranteeing equality of treatment for all religious communities, promising the reform of religious courts, and opening military service and government positions to non-Muslims. These were significant commitments, and they reflected a genuine vision, held by the most forward-thinking of the Tanzimat reformers, of an Ottoman citizenship that would transcend religious and ethnic difference, binding the diverse populations of the empire together in a shared loyalty to the state rather than to their respective communities. This vision, which historians call Ottomanism, was an attempt to answer the challenge of nationalism, the idea, spreading from Western Europe across the continent, that the proper unit of political organization was the nation, defined by shared language or ethnicity or religion, with a different kind of political identity, one that was defined by shared membership in the Ottoman polity rather than by any single cultural or religious characteristic. It was a generous and in some ways beautiful vision, and it had its genuine adherents among the educated populations of many different backgrounds within the empire. But it faced formidable obstacles. The nationalist movements that were reshaping European politics in the 19th century were powerful precisely because they drew on deep wells of cultural attachment and historical memory that no administrative reform could simply override. The Greek state had already come into existence. The Serbian Principality, which had won autonomy from the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s, was moving steadily toward full independence. In Romania, in Bulgaria, in Bosnia, in other regions of the Balkans, the ideas of national self-determination were taking root among educated populations who were reading European books and newspapers and drawing their own conclusions about the proper organization of political life. The wars of 1877 and 1878 between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, fought partly in the Balkans and partly in the Caucasus, resulted in the most severe territorial losses the empire had yet experienced in a single conflict. Bulgaria emerged as an autonomous principality. Serbia and Romania and Montenegro achieved full independence. Large territories in the Caucasus passed to Russian control. The Treaty of Berlin in 1878, negotiated under the supervision of the great European powers, redrew the map of southeastern Europe in ways that left the Ottoman Empire considerably smaller than it had been, its European territories reduced to a fragment of what they had once been. The long Ottoman presence in the Balkans, nearly 5 centuries of administration and settlement and cultural exchange, contracting rapidly toward its conclusion. These losses were absorbed by an empire that was simultaneously dealing with severe financial crisis. In 1875, the Ottoman government had been forced to suspend payment on its foreign debts, an event that sent tremors through the European financial world and led eventually, in 1881, to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an institution staffed largely by European financial officials that took direct control of several major Ottoman revenue streams in order to service the empire's foreign obligations. The existence of this institution, this foreign body managing a significant portion of the imperial finances from within the empire's own territory, was a visible and uncomfortable symbol of the degree to which the empire's financial autonomy had been compromised. The degree to which the independence it still formally possessed was constrained by the practical realities of its economic situation. Abdulhamid II, who came to the throne in 1876 and would reign until 1909, was one of the most complex and contested figures in all of Ottoman history. He had initially accepted the promulgation of the first Ottoman constitution, a document that established a parliament and sought to institutionalize the reform process in a more formal framework of constitutional governance. But within 2 years, after the disasters of the 1877 to 1878 war, he suspended the constitution and dissolved the parliament, governing instead through a system of centralized personal rule that used the expanded telegraph and railway networks and an elaborate intelligence service to maintain closer control over the empire's far-flung territories than previous sultans had been able to exercise. Abdul Hamid's approach to the empire's situation was, in its own way, a response to real problems: the centrifugal pressures of nationalism, the financial constraints that limited the state's capacity for action, the military weakness that made the empire vulnerable to external pressure. He understood the importance of Islam as a unifying force in an empire where the other potential foundations of loyalty, Ottoman civic identity, dynastic sentiment, were being eroded by nationalist movements and financial hardship. He cultivated the caliphal dimension of the Ottoman sultan's identity with more deliberate intention than most of his predecessors, positioning himself as the leader of the Muslim world, building mosques and religious schools, using the Hijaz Railway, that remarkable engineering project that extended the rail network all the way to Medina, as both a practical improvement to the pilgrimage infrastructure and a symbolic demonstration of the Ottoman sultan's care for the holy places and the Muslim faithful. The Hijaz Railway, which was funded partly by voluntary contributions from Muslims across the world as well as by the Ottoman state, was completed as far as Medina in 1908, a remarkable achievement of engineering and logistics. The iron line running through the harsh landscape of the Arabian Peninsula, crossing wadis and climbing gradients in the long, slow work of construction that had occupied years of effort. The trains that ran along it carried pilgrims southward from Damascus toward the holy cities, compressing a journey that had traditionally taken weeks of difficult desert travel into days of relative comfort. The landscape moving past the windows with a speed that would have seemed extraordinary to earlier generations of pilgrims who had made the same journey on foot and camel, measuring the distance in the slow steps of animals and the gradual turning of the stars overhead. The late 19th century also saw a remarkable flowering of Ottoman intellectual and literary life, a generation of writers and thinkers who were engaging with European ideas and forms, while working to understand what was distinctive and valuable about the Ottoman and Islamic heritage, how the two might be held in productive relationship rather than simple opposition. Namik Kemal, poet and playwright and political journalist, wrote with passionate conviction about constitutional government and Ottoman patriotism. Ahmed Midhat Effendi produced an enormous body of popular fiction and journalism that engaged the growing reading public with questions of modernity and tradition, science and religion, the proper life for an Ottoman in a changing world. Ibrahim Shinasi helped establish modern Turkish prose as a literary form capable of handling the new subjects and new modes of thought that the century was generating. These were people living through a genuinely difficult historical moment with considerable intellectual courage, trying to make sense of their situation with the tools available to them, contributing to a conversation about identity and modernity that would continue long after the empire itself had ended. The Young Turk movement, which had been developing in opposition to Abdul Hamid's autocratic rule since the 1890s, came to power in 1908 in what is known as the Young Turk Revolution, a constitutional revolution that restored the 1876 constitution and re-established parliamentary governance without initially removing Abdul Hamid himself, who nominally continued to reign under the new constitutional arrangement. The Young Turks, organized primarily through a movement called the Committee of Union and Progress, were a diverse coalition united primarily by their opposition to Abdul Hamid's style of rule and their conviction that the empire needed to modernize more rapidly and more systematically if it was to survive. They were young men, many of them military officers, educated in the new schools that the Tanzimat had created, reading European political thought alongside Ottoman traditions, deeply anxious about the empire's vulnerability and determined to do something about it. Abdul Hamid was deposed in 1909, following a counter-revolutionary attempt that gave the Committee of Union and Progress the justification it needed to remove him entirely. He was sent into exile in Salonika, the great cosmopolitan Ottoman port city of the northern Aegean, and then, after Salonika itself was lost to Greece in the Balkan Wars, brought back to Istanbul, where he spent his remaining years quietly, an old man reading and gardening, the former ruler of an empire that was changing so rapidly around him that it must have seemed almost unrecognizable from the world he had known in the long decades of his reign. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were, in their territorial consequences, among the most dramatic events in the empire's final decades. In the space of two brief and intense conflicts, the Ottoman Empire lost virtually all of its remaining European territory, the territories that had been at the heart of Ottoman power since the 14th century, the lands of Thrace and Macedonia and Albania, and Epirus, where the empire had first established itself on the European continent, where Ottoman culture had put down roots deep enough to last 5 centuries. Salonika, one of the most important cities in the empire, a place of extraordinary cultural diversity with its large Sephardic Jewish community, and its Greek and Bulgarian and Turkish populations living in the layered, complex proximity that Ottoman cities had always produced, was lost to Greece. Edirne, the ancient second capital, the city of Sinan's great mosque, and of centuries of Ottoman ceremonial and administration, was briefly lost and then recovered, but the recovery was itself a reminder of how fragile what had seemed permanent had become. The First World War, into which the Ottoman Empire entered in November 1914 on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, was the final catastrophe, the event that broke what the long 19th century of pressure and loss had only bent. The decision to enter the war was made by a small group within the Committee of Union and Progress leadership, particularly Enver Pasha, the ambitious and energetic war minister, who believed that alliance with Germany offered the empire its best chance to recover lost territories and restore its strength. It was a calculation that proved tragically mistaken, though the mistakes were not entirely visible in advance, as such mistakes rarely are. The war fronts were multiple and exhausting. In Gallipoli in 1915, Ottoman forces successfully defended the Dardanelles against a major Allied assault, a campaign of desperate intensity fought on the cliffs and ridges above the narrow waterway, the terrain itself brutal, the summer heat extreme, the casualties enormous on both sides. The defense of Gallipoli became, in the memory of the Ottoman successor state and of the many nations whose soldiers died there, one of the defining moments of the war, a reminder that the empire, even in its weakened state, could still mount a ferocious and effective defense of its heartland when directly threatened. Mustafa Kemal, the Ottoman commander who distinguished himself in the Gallipoli campaign, would carry the memory of that defense forward into the next phase of his extraordinary career. But the other fronts told a different story. In the Caucasus, an Ottoman offensive in the winter of 1914 to 1915 ended in catastrophic defeat. The army that Enver Pasha had led personally into the mountain snows destroyed by the combination of Russian resistance and the terrible conditions of winter warfare in the high passes. In Mesopotamia, British forces advanced slowly up the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. In the Arab lands, a British-supported Arab revolt began in 1916. The Hashemite Sharif Hussein of Mecca raising the flag of Arab independence against Ottoman authority in a development that carried enormous symbolic weight. The guardian of the holy cities turning against the caliph who claimed their protection. By 1917 and 1918, British forces had taken Baghdad and Jerusalem, the ancient and holy cities of the empire's Arab provinces passing under foreign military occupation, with a quiet devastation that those who lived through it would remember for the rest of their lives. The Armistice of Mudros in October 1918 ended the Ottoman participation in the war, and with it, for all practical purposes, the empire itself. The capital was occupied by Allied forces. The Sultan's government signed the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, a document that partitioned the remaining Ottoman territories among the victorious Allied powers and their client states, leaving the Ottoman state in control of only a rump of Anatolia, its sovereignty hollowed out by provisions giving the European powers extensive rights of intervention and supervision. It was a peace that felt less like the end of a war than the administration of an ending that had been long in coming, the formal conclusion of a process that had been underway for a century and a half. But history, as it always does, was more complex than any single narrative of ending could capture. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal and a movement of resistance that would become the Turkish War of Independence were already organizing against both the Allied occupation and the Sultan's government that had signed the Sevres Treaty. Between 1919 and 1922, the Turkish nationalist movement fought and won a war against Greek, Armenian, French, and British-supported forces that resulted in the negotiation of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, a document that superseded the Treaty of Sevres and recognized the sovereignty of a new Turkish state in Anatolia and eastern Thrace. On the 29th of October 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, and on the 3rd of March 1924, the Caliphate itself was abolished by the new Turkish Grand National Assembly, the last Ottoman Sultan having already left Istanbul by foreign ship in November 1922, departing the city that had been the center of the Ottoman world for nearly 5 centuries in the early morning hours. The Bosphorus quiet and dark around the vessel that carried him away. The last caliph, Abdulmesid II, who had held the caliphal title without the sultanate in the brief interregnum between the abolition of the sultanate and the abolition of the caliphate, left Istanbul on a train, simply, without ceremony, carrying what could be carried in luggage, leaving behind the palace and the city and the accumulated weight of 6 centuries of history. He would spend the rest of his long life in exile in Europe, in Paris, in Nice, a painter and a musician, a cultivated and gentle man who lived quietly with his art in the long aftermath of his dynasty's ending, painting Turkish scenes from memory in European rooms, the Istanbul of his childhood and youth present in his canvases with the particular vividness of things known completely, and then lost. The civilization that ended with the Ottoman Empire did not disappear entirely, of course. Civilizations do not disappear, They transform. They leave traces. They persist in the languages and the customs and the built environment and the deep cultural memory of the peoples who inhabited them. The mosques of Sinan still stand in Istanbul and Edirne, their domes catching the light as they have always caught it, their interiors still holding that quality of luminous calm that their architect built into them with such deliberate genius. The old bazaars of Istanbul and Cairo and Damascus still function, still full of the sounds and smells of trade, the vaulted passages still echoing with footsteps and voices in the same spaces where generations of merchants have stood and negotiated and drunk their coffee, and watched the light shift on the ancient stone. The languages of the former empire carry within them the layers of Ottoman vocabulary that centuries of shared civilization deposited. Turkish words in Greek, Arabic words in Turkish, Persian words woven through both. The linguistic residue of a world that was genuinely multilingual and multicultural in its daily operation. The old roads of Anatolia still follow, in many places, the routes that Ottoman caravans traveled for centuries. The landscape they pass through still shaped by the geological patience of the same hills and rivers that shaped it when the empire was young. In the villages of the former Ottoman world, from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, there are old buildings, hands and mosques and fountains and the houses of former officials that carry within their stones the quiet testimony of what was built here, and how it was built and by whose order and in what spirit. These buildings do not speak dramatically. They simply stand in the afternoon light, in the morning mist, in the blue cold of winter and the golden warmth of summer, holding their years as old things hold their years, without urgency, without drama, with the patient dignity of things that have lasted. The Bosphorus still moves between its shores, still carries its dark current from the Black Sea to the Marmara, still reflects the sky and the clouds and the passing ships in its deep and shifting surface. The minarets of Istanbul still rise against the sky in the early morning, the call to prayer still moving outward from them in the ancient melodic patterns, finding its way through the streets and across the water, the same formula that has been spoken in the same rhythm since the earliest days of Islam, connecting this morning to all the mornings that have come before it, across all the centuries of this city's long, layered, luminous life. The empire is gone in the way that all empires go, gradually, then completely, the formal structures dissolved, the administration ended, the dynasty exiled or dispersed. But the 6 centuries that it inhabited, the slow rise from a small Anatolian principality to the vast civilization that stretched from Vienna to the Persian Gulf, the long golden afternoon of Suleiman's reign, the patient complexity of the palace world, the difficult and serious work of the reforming centuries, the final terrible decade of the World War and its aftermath. Those centuries were real and full and serious and beautiful in their way, and they happened and they mattered. And they left their marks on the world in ways that have not faded and will not fade. The evening light settles now over the old city, the same light it has always been, warm and unhurried and indifferent to the passage of particular empires. The stones absorb it and release it, as they have always done. The water moves. The sky turns almost imperceptibly from gold to rose to the deep, still blue of the first hour of night. And somewhere in that blue, in that deepening quiet, all of it rests. The centuries and the sultans, the caravans and the campaigns, the mosques and the poems, the reforms and the losses, the whole long, patient, extraordinary story of the Ottoman world, settling into the silence like dust settling after a long journey, finding its rest at last in the cool and ancient dark.